So I want to take our week 2 assignment and kind of go through it piece by piece with you, because this is really an important article, not only for just juvenile justice, but this really applies to every aspect of your education. You know, the idea of evidence-based programs, which is what Peter Greenwood discusses in great detail, is extremely important to our entire system. And you've probably seen me in the first couple of weeks really kind of hark on the importance of these evidence-based programs. You know, I ask the question a lot in the discussions, well, is there any evidence to back that? You know, if you say, well, I think we should throw all these kids in prison. Well, is there any evidence to back that? I know you guys get frustrated hearing that from me, but, you know, the reality of it is that having evidence to back that up is rather important. You know, the evidence would actually show that incarcerating kids doesn't help reduce crime. And you have to ask the question, I think, you know, what are we after? Are we after reducing crime? Are we after reducing crime and spending the least amount of money possible? Are we after getting vengeance for these kids' actions? I'll show you. You hurt me, and I'm going to hurt you back. You know, does that work? I don't know that really works. And that's what the Greenwood article kind of talks about. And we'll go through it kind of piece by piece here. We'll skip some pages. We won't talk about the whole thing. I'm not going to read it to you, but I think maybe you'll get some insight into some key important parts here. So really this first page is his introduction, and something you guys see a lot in your grades back from me is, you know, write your introduction like the introductions you read. So often we get caught up in writing kind of like we did in high school. You know, they taught us to, well, write a sentence saying this is what your paper's about, and then write a sentence about your first paragraph, and write a sentence about your second paragraph, and write a sentence about your third paragraph, and then conclude your paragraph. Well, that's not always the best way to write an introduction to a paper. And sometimes I think the best way to write an introduction is just to kind of follow what you're going to read here. You'll see he kind of follows that general idea, but he also introduces a little bit of information, a little bit of teaser information as to maybe why this is important. So in our introduction, pulling key points from his introduction might be a good place to start. So let's talk about some key points he brings up. Here's key point number 1. Most adult criminals begin their criminal careers as juveniles. That's a good thing to bring up. Now, once again, this is something you would have to cite, that you're getting this information from him. But, you know, he brings it up, he mentions it, he kind of bases his research on it. So we should probably keep that into there. And that's probably a good reason why we need to find programs that work at preventing juvenile delinquency. If we can reduce juvenile delinquency, we can probably reduce adult crime. So, and that's what he kind of goes on to. The other thing he discusses in here is his first mention of these evidence-based practices. So this might be another key point, particularly if we look at the title of the assignment is evidence-based programs. So that might be an idea of where we're looking at the assignment title and maybe the assignment criteria, and then applying it to what you're reading. But if we go back a little bit, we see here another thing that you've seen discussed a little bit in class is that, you know, many of these popular delinquency prevention programs, such as DARE, Scared Straight, boot camps, and transferring to adult courts, are ineffective at best. And then an even more important point, some even increase the risk of delinquency. So this is where coming in your introduction and saying, you know, some of what we've had in the past doesn't really lead to positive results, in kind of forcing us as a an industry or a field to kind of look a little deeper into what's going on. So now we get really into the first major point of the assignment. How do we figure out what works? It's kind of the key. Kind of the key to all of our research really is, how exactly do we determine what works and what doesn't work? Well, there are some major issues, particularly with the juvenile population, in determining what works and what doesn't work. And Greenwood here discusses some of those issues. And some of them he discusses in a little more detail, and some of them he just brings up. But it's important to understand that there are a variety of issues that come into play when we evaluate these juvenile programs. One of the first ones, and he discusses it. He starts out with it and then discusses it in a little more detail. Is that these programs often focus on behavior over long periods of time. This is like the number one problem that you'll find when you're doing research. And if we go back and look at some of the research on Scared Straight, for example, we'll find out that that initial evidence showed a positive outcome. But it only looked at about a year's worth of behavior, in a lot of cases less than a year, even 6 months worth of behavior. So it showed that positive outcome. But then as we spread that out over a longer period of time, and we started looking at 2, 3, 4 years later, even into adulthood, we found that almost every one of those initial Scared Straight participants ended up back in prison at some point in time. So, though, there was a short-term benefit, maybe a 6-month benefit. But we have to be looking at, from a program point of view, you have to be looking at a couple things. Is that 6-month benefit worthwhile? And is there a possibility that what we did to get that 6-month benefit then makes them more likely to commit crimes later? And that's kind of what we found with Scared Straight. But he discusses that, one of the biggest difficulties is that it takes a long time to conduct this research because we have to look at it over long, long periods of time, sometimes well beyond their juvenile ages. And that becomes an issue when we conduct evaluations. Then Greenwood goes a little farther to discuss, in this paragraph, we won't go into a whole lot of detail, he discusses a specific example where, we spent a long time saying that, hey, it's home life, it's neighborhood, it's lack of socialization, it's, it's socioeconomic issues, it's labeling theory that we discussed in week 1 and 2. But then later on we figured out that this didn't actually have any evidence to support that these were happening. And then the interventions that we provided, these residential schools, summer camps, stuff like that, none of them were consistently helpful, and they removed those specific characteristics that we said were causing delinquency. So we in turn determined that, hey, it really can't be those specific things that are causing delinquency. And then Greenwood goes into more detail down here where he discusses some specifics about the whole time analysis, and that early childhood interventions, even at 4 or 5 years old, can play a major part, and we'll see this in some of the programs he advocates later, can play a major impact of the possibility of delinquency in juveniles as they get older, into adolescence. And then things that we apply in adolescence can have a major impact, and he specifically brings out the workforce being the key issue, but they can have a major impact when that juvenile gets old enough to get into the workforce. So we have to look at these long-term things. Even if we see an initial negative, it may not be just cause to destroy the program to get rid of it or to not use it. Where we want to start getting rid of stuff is after years and years of evaluation, we start seeing that there is no benefit. DARE, for example, after years and years of evaluation, we've seen there is really no benefit. Scared straight, after years and years of evaluation, we've not only seen there isn't a benefit, but we've also seen that, well, it could actually make them more likely to commit crimes. So you'll see that that those programs, have to be evaluated over a long period of time. That's really the important thing to look at here in this section, is that, the key issue is that we need to be looking at a long period of time in our research. And in studies that are only looking at 1 month or 1 year or even 2 years, they're not really providing us an adequate evaluation. Then he goes on to discuss kind of the scientific method and how really, one of the biggest flaws in research in the criminal justice system as a whole is the lack of use of solid scientific approaches. He calls them down here, he calls them experiments, and that's what they are. Experiments that compare the effects of youth who have been assigned to a randomly chosen alternative intervention. And that's the key to the scientific method. It has to be random. It has to be completely random. We have 100 people, and 50 of them are going to be assigned to the control group, and 50 of them are going to be assigned to the treatment. And which 50 they are has to be completely random. This is extremely difficult to do in the criminal justice system, primarily because of, rights. I mean, you have a right to not be exposed to some crazy treatment program that might be longer than an alternative sentence, if we were to just send you to prison. So, there's a lot of factors that come into play here that he discusses. So one thing we do use a lot in the criminal justice system is meta-analysis, which he discusses, and a quasi-experimental design. And the quasi-experimental design is where we look at people who have gone into the treatment option and people who have not been assigned to the treatment option, but we don't necessarily randomly assign them to either side. So that's kind of the easiest way to kind of see, that quasi-experimental method. It provides us valid results, but there's an issue there. We have to understand that there's an issue in that research. Unfortunately, long-term research using an actual experimental method is just far too expensive for most local jurisdictions to handle. So that's why we see a lot of the research being more broad. We don't see some of these smaller programs having research to show that they work. But we do see some here and there. So then as we go further, he talks a little bit more in depth about that experimental design and the quasi-experimental design. And here's a key point in here where he says, the weaker design, the more likely the evaluation is to report an intervention has a positive effect, and the less likely it is to report negative effects. This should be a big red light to you and something to look for as you look at these studies. The weaker the design of the study, the more likely it is to create a positive effect. Well, how do we, what exactly does this mean to research? Well, let's go down here a little bit farther, and we'll see him mention this point. And this is probably one of my most interesting points that gets discussed a lot by students in classes. Different reviewers often come to very different conclusions about what does and does not work. Now, you say, if the evidence is out there, we use these scientific methods, we should all come to the same conclusion. But the reality of it is most of our research is meta-analysis and quasi-scientific analysis. And those are relatively weak forms of analysis. It's not to say they're not valid, but they're definitely things that should be scrutinized a little more. So if you were a program, like let's say DARE, and we'll kind of use this as an example, and you kind of know that, hey, the weaker our experiment is, the more likely it is to show a positive result. Maybe we can pull the wool over some people's eyes. Well, if you want to show a positive result, you can weaken your experimental design and still show a positive result. So that's why you will see some research out there that points in both directions. The best way to determine which of these researchers is more accurate is to look at which side carries the most clout. For example, if you search in the library and you find 2 studies that say DARE is this incredible program and it works so well, but you find 100 studies that say DARE is terrible, your conclusion should probably side with the 100 studies. More often than not, you're going to have stronger experimental designs. And less often, these weaker experimental designs will make it through the peer review process. So the peer review process will kind of create this higher quality or higher quantity outcome for the stronger results and a lower quantity outcome for the weaker results. So that's just something to look at. He discusses blueprints over here. We'll mention it here, but I'm not going to go into grand detail about it. Blueprints for violence prevention. This is a key point, okay? If you don't mention blueprints in your paper, you're probably going to lose a lot of points. He talks a lot about blueprints, and blueprints is important. It's really one of the biggest evidence-based concepts out there right now. So it's a University of Colorado program. You can look it up. You can read what he says about it. He discusses it a lot. So another thing that Greenwood discusses here is this idea of meta-analysis. And you'll actually see that a lot of the research he does in this paper, when we get into the charts and graphs a little later on, a lot of what he did was simply meta-analysis. He looked at huge piles of data already collected in research and applied them to what he wanted to do. So meta-analysis, another important way for us to determine, effectiveness. However, it's a weaker step on the research ladder than that pure scientific method. Of course, if that meta-analysis is all using stuff collected from the scientific method, then you probably have a little bit stronger than if it were not. Something to consider. And then he also discusses cost-benefit analysis, and that this is an important part of our analysis. But something that we need to remember about cost-benefit is the criminal justice system isn't out there to make money. It's kind of out there to spend money, and it's going to spend money regardless. We still do want to find the most cost-effective measures, the most cost-effective programs we can put out there. But you know what? If a program really works, and its big hang-up is that it costs a little bit more than other programs, that may not always be a bad thing. Now, if the program doesn't work and it costs a whole lot of money, like boot camps and stuff like that, then it's just further fuel for your fire. And Greenwood continues to discuss this whole cost-benefit analysis thing, and like I said, I'm not going to read this whole thing to you. I'm just going to hit some key points that I think are important. So now Greenwood kind of starts to get into what is another key point of your assignment, and that is, what works and what doesn't work. We've kind of determined how to determine what works and what doesn't work. We have the basics there, but now we have to figure out, what actually works and what doesn't work. And Greenwood uses a kind of unique approach, And I want to caution you to not get caught up in the words here, because sometimes students get caught up in the words and come out with they come out with it's a little different analysis than might be accurate. We talk about name brand and generic. Those are the two things that that Greenwood discusses, or his two labels that he applies, and often people kind of look at name brand and generic in a little different sense. But really, the idea of generic programs and brand name or name brand programs are pretty easy to understand. So generic programs are just general ideas or general strategies that can be implemented anywhere in anything that would help the program. So, he discusses the whole preschool behavior modification thing. It's one of those things that, if we can apply these behavior modification things at a young age, it'll impact the outcome of delinquency as the youth gets older. The brand name programs are a little bit more specific. These are like the functional family therapy, the multi-systemic therapy. This is like boot camp. These are all things that would fit in there. They are specific programs. They're kind of like all-encompassing programs. It would be, you can go to the store and you can buy all the ingredients and apply those ingredients to your to your recipe if you were cooking something. Or you can go to the frozen food aisle and you can buy a frozen package of meatloaf, where they put all the ingredients kind of together for you. That's really kind of how this whole generic and name brand thing works. Generic things are things we can include anywhere. Implementing community policing strategies in police departments, utilizing diversion programs, things that you can implement at any level or in various levels of the system. These name brand programs are specific concepts or ideas that kind of are all-encompassing and work all by themselves. So that's the whole idea behind this whole name brand and generic thing that sometimes causes a little confusion. So now we look at this table, and there's 2 pages of this table. And I think it's kind of interesting, and I'm going to pick just a few of them, and we'll look at just a few, and we'll see, some of the main areas to look at are, number 1, this evidence-based status category, and then this effect on crime category, and then this total benefit to cost ratio. Now, like I said, all 3 of these things, or well, really it's the effect on crime and the total cost benefit ratio. They're kind of encompassing on their own. You can have a huge effect on crime and a low cost to benefit ratio and still have a relatively effective program. So that's just something to kind of look at, is that, you could have a good thing on one side and a good thing on the other side, and it's great. You could have a good thing on one side and a bad thing on the other side. It could still be good. It's not necessarily a bad thing. So in some of the pages that I didn't discuss here, he talks about different programs specifically, and these are all programs that are in that table, and he discusses them specifically. But I wanted to point this out because a lot of people pick this program to show up in their papers, and that's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It doesn't really matter. I find it interesting that, oddly enough, a lot of people pick this program, this prenatal early infancy project in Elmira in New York. A lot of people pick this program to discuss. They actually found it's actually been quite effective, not only reducing delinquency but reducing welfare use to unmarried mothers. lower income side, which might actually play into the whole idea of where socioeconomics fits within criminal or delinquent behavior. But I did want to point that out, that a lot of students pick that program. So we'll move on a little bit and kind of get to the key point Greenwood mentions about this is this here. And he's kind of got it big and bold for you, is that these programs that are successful almost always emphasize family cohesiveness. They almost always talk about working together as a family. They almost always include the entire family, and they almost always focus on providing skills to the parents, because the parents are the ones who are in the prime spot to make changes in these kids' lives. It's these parents that are going to be able to influence them a whole lot more than the court is, even with supervision programs, that they don't last forever. Parents spend more time with their kids, in theory, than anyone else. So really, Greenwood talks about a lot of programs here. In this, for the assignment, you probably only need to pick 1 or 2, 3, and talk about them. You don't have to talk about every single thing, but pick some stuff that works and some stuff that doesn't work, and discuss it. So now Greenwood kind of gets to the next key point of the assignment, the next kind of bullet point in the assignment. That's, what do we do to implement these best practices? And there's a couple of different approaches to this. And really, I'm not opposed to either direction of approaching this. You can approach this in your assignment as either, well, here are these generic things that we can do to implement into our programs to make them more effective, or you can say, here are these name brand things. Here's something we can do. And I left this part of the assignment relatively vague to kind of give you guys plenty of leeway to go whatever direction. I mean, you could go as far as saying, hey, we've got a probation and a parole program, and here's something we can implement in this probation and parole program. Or you can say that, in any program we can implement some specific steps. So let's talk about these specific steps a little bit. Here's number one thing that he discusses that I think is quite interesting. It's where he talks about cost-benefit analysis. Remember earlier, I pointed out that sometimes cost-benefit analysis is not the best way to look at it. We're in a system that inherently spends money. It's not in the business of making money. It's spending money to eradicate a problem or reduce a problem, and that's what it's doing. Sometimes that costs money. But what Washington State's Institute for Public Policy has found out, and what you can see by looking at the cost-benefit analysis stuff in that table that we looked at, is that most of these evidence-proven programs are cost-effective. They actually save the system money over time. So that's something to kind of keep in mind, is that, hey, effective programs from an evidence point of view will almost always be cost-benefit in some way, shape, or form. But as you evaluate programs, you'll see, just talking about a couple of things he discusses. He discusses these gaps in service, and then he calls them service gaps later. And essentially, anytime you don't have a viable option to treat the problem, you've got a service gap. And one of the big things we can do generically, just overall, is define these service gaps and then implement them. You got to think there are service gaps in every aspect of the system, whether you're running a rehabilitation facility, whether you're talking about a corrections facility, whether you're talking about a probation department or a court or even a police department. We can find service gaps specific to certain areas of the system. So for a police department, maybe we find the big service gap is that we've got areas of our community that are lower on the socioeconomic totem pole, and they have far higher crime rates, or far higher juvenile crime rates, or far higher status offense occurrences. Well, is there something we can do? Maybe we can step up community policing in those areas. That's a service gap. We find in a lot of departments that there are neighborhoods that get responded to a lot, but they don't get that community policing attention that they may need. Those are the places where community policing is the most important. And a lot of police officers look at those places as the places where they only go when they're called. And it shouldn't necessarily be that way. So there's an example of a service gap. So he talks about implementing blueprints. You can implement blueprints. That's a name brand response. You can use the meta-analysis to find what you need to do. Those are all, again, name brand responses. But here's another one, and this is important. This is a key to blueprints, because blueprints discusses it. But it's also a generic approach as well. It talks about training. Blueprints emphasizes training. If you go back and read the section about blueprints, or read, at University of Colorado stuff, blueprints emphasizes training to the practitioners. And this can occur at any level. This can occur at the courts, the probation. This can occur at police departments. As a matter of fact, looking for your week 5 assignment, and here's just kind of a hint, something that we can do at the police level is to implement juvenile-specific training, because there's a lot of departments that don't have training specific to juveniles. They don't understand how the juvenile system works, or how the juvenile system is different once it gets beyond their control, or why certain policies are in place. So this training can be a really important way to implement proven practices. And Greenwood discusses the whole training thing into a little more detail, and the whole analytics and things like that. And we've discussed all that. Like I said, I don't want to read the whole thing to you, but here is what I find to be another very key point that should make its way in every single paper. That's this section right here. Once again, it's a big bold thing that he points out, and it kind of leads to the idea that sometimes these evidence-based practices, for some reason, aren't the most popular amongst users or practitioners. Only 5% of those eligible for evidence-based programs actually participate in one. So, despite all this research showing the effectiveness of a program, we don't have a whole lot of participation in these evidence-proven programs. We tend to gear ourselves more towards assumptions. I saw it in facilities I've worked in. I've seen it in facilities I've visited where, well, we do this because so-and-so wants it. We do this because a judge likes it. Despite the fact that it may not actually be helping at all. It may even be hurting. If we took that out, would it make it better? Or does it not change anything? So that's kind of an important point. So Greenwood also discusses these challenges and obstacles for implementing evidence-based programs, another key point of your assignment. And we won't go into a whole lot of detail here, but you'll see that funding is a major challenge, and we can expect that. Especially in today's economy, programs just don't have the money that they had before. And to implement these things up front costs a lot of money, and he discusses that kind of in detail. He also discusses training and the idea that maybe we need to incorporate training that's evidence-based, and that can play a role as well. I mean, it really is a never-ending saga. But he talks a lot about the different problems with implementing these programs, and cost is kind of the number one thing. This is another interesting point to read, and like I say, you shouldn't base your paper off of these big bold areas, but they kind of do point out that they're key points or they're interesting little tidbits of information, and and I'll just read it. Every year of delay in implementing evidence-based reforms consigns another cohort of juvenile offenders to a 50% higher than necessary recidivism rate. So every year that we don't implement these evidence-based programs, we're essentially taking a cohort as kind of a group that all apply to the same thing. You can just think of it as one big group of people. We kind of force those cohorts into a 50% more likely chance that they're not going to be successful citizens, that they're going to commit crimes, they're going to recidivate later in life. Once again, kind of playing on the key of the key importance of evidence-based programs. And I won't get too much into Greenwood's conclusion here. There are a lot of good points in here. The one I'll point out, and it's on the other page that I didn't show, is political changes. And I want you to think about this and how it affects our system. Are there programs out there that are politically motivated and are still in existence because of political motivations that maybe don't do anything? I think if you think about it hard enough, you'll find some programs. But what I kind of hope is that I wanted to take one of these papers and discuss it in a little more detail to kind of give you an idea of how to apply it to your paper, so that now as we move into the team papers and your big individual assignment that's coming up, that's a major part of your grade, that we kind of see maybe a better way to implement these writings into your papers. And this assignment's unique. It's a summary. I want you to stick with pretty much just this information. That's the idea behind the summary. And there's a lot of information to fit into a very small paper. But as we move forward, you're going to be doing research on your own. You're going to be going out there and finding research in the library. And I want you to be able to kind of see that, these are kind of the key points when we're looking at research that we need to look at, these evidence-based programs.